Everybody, and welcome to this ARO Zoom meeting. This is a seminar series that is centered around the topic of music perception. My name is Robert Zatori. I will be your moderator today. I'm a professor at Montreal Neurological Institute of McGill University, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce our speaker today, who is Professor Ani Patel. Before I introduce him, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the organization of the talk. In particular, if you have questions during the presentation, just use the chat function on Zoom, directed to me as the moderator, and that way you won't interrupt the presenter. And following the presentation, I will try to ask some of the questions at least. And you may also raise your hand for a discussion at the end. If we have time, you can unmute yourself and ask directly your questions of Professor Patel. There is closed captioning available for the meeting. The meeting is being recorded so that it will be available for viewing afterwards. Ani Patel is a professor of psychology at Tufts University, and I have had the pleasure of knowing him for a very long time. Actually, I was reminiscing, Ani, that I think the first time I met you was when you were, I think, still a grad student, and you came to Montreal to work with my colleague Isabelle Peretz, who sort of, I remember you gave a little presentation and she was like nudging me and saying, keep your eye on this kid. He's really going places. And I don't know how long ago that was, probably 30 years ago. But
something like that, yeah.
Indeed, she was correct. So Ani has many varied interests, and his training sort of reflects that. He actually earned his PhD in biology at Harvard with the famous Edward O. Wilson, who is famous especially for studying ants. And I remember, Ani, you telling me one time about at some point you were, I don't know where, like in Indonesia, digging up ants in a hot place, and you were saying, okay, ants are really cool and really interesting, but maybe I don't want to be digging up ants the rest of my life.
Right.
But you know, Edward O. Wilson is not only famous for his biological work, but also for his sort of philosophical stance in terms of like his book on consilience, which is about bringing together science and art. And I think your career, Ani, exemplifies very much that perspective, where in your research, although it's primarily focused on science, you certainly have some sensibilities towards art, and particularly auditory art, which is to say music. I could take the entire time today just to go over all of Ani's amazing research accomplishments and his great publications. I do want to mention his famous 2008 book, Music, Language, and the Brain, which I was looking up and has had 3,500 citations. It's really amazing. And there, I hear in the grapevine, there's another great book coming out on music and evolution. We're all looking forward to that. I think maybe I will just let you speak because I really don't want to take up all the time, but I will say I'm extremely pleased that ARO has selected you for the first speaker on this series on music perception. And we're really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. It's an honor to have you here moderating. Thank you to the ARO for inviting me, and to Jessica McLean for spearheading that. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. So I will start by sharing my screen, my sound, slides, and okay. See my slides, everybody? Yep, good. All right, great. So the topic today is, can musical training influence speech processing? So I'm going to give you a quick roadmap, the outline here, which is, first I'm going to talk about the motivation for asking this question, broadly speaking about some similarities between music and speech as communicative systems. And another motivation is associations between musical ability or training and enhanced speech processing. And finally, evidence for neuroplasticity driven by musical training. Then I'll ask, even if the answer to this question is yes, that musical training can influence speech processing, why would you use it to enhance speech processing in the real world? And I just want to emphasize, I'm not talking at all, and I never have, about replacing speech-based training with musical training, but just complementing it with musical-based training. I'll talk about reasons why you might want to use music to enhance speech processing, music and reward. And I'll talk about what is meant by musical training and some examples of populations that might benefit from that training, from such training. And then the rest of the talk will be about the need for theoretical frameworks to explain why musical training would enhance speech processing. I'll focus on my own framework called the ARO hypothesis, developed across a few papers, most recently 2014 in hearing research. And it's just now one of several frameworks that have been proposed by several people. Okay, so let's just jump in. Broadly speaking, we can talk about some similarities between speech and music as communicative systems in a sensible way. I think we can all agree they both use sound sequences with fine-grained modulations of timing, amplitude, and frequency. Both have rhythm and melody, structured patterns in time and pitch. Both involve tight links between auditory and motor processing and learning and production. And both involve hierarchically structured sequences that are made from perceptually discrete elements combined in principled ways. So in my book, I took a deep dive into the analysis of similarities and differences between speech and music in terms of pitch and timbre patterns, rhythm, melody, syntax, and affect, and so on. And the general takeaway was that I felt it was sort of like a Venn diagram situation in the brain, that for any attribute we wanted to look at, rhythm, melody, there were definitely some important differences between music and speech. But then if you dug down, sometimes in non-obvious ways, there were also interesting links and connections. And I think that holds at multiple levels, rhythm, melody, syntax, and so forth. All right, so that's very broad. We'll get back to that in more detail later. But now let's ask about another motivation for asking this question, and that's the association between musical ability or training and enhanced speech processing. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Two, exactly. One having to do with enhanced speech and noise perception. So this was a study I was involved in with Ganesh Swaminathan and the lab of Gerald Kidd at BU, kind of a cocktail party problem experiment, where a speaker had to understand a target sentence T flanked by maskers spatially to the left and right, M1 and M2. These were all intelligible sentences, and we were measuring at what SNR could the target be understood. And musicians did significantly better by several dB in this test. This particular experiment has been replicated in a multi-site replication that's quite recent. Kelly Whiteford presented this at the Society for Music Perception and Cognition meeting this summer. It involves many labs. Andrew Oxenham is one of the organizers of this project. And I should point out, though, that speech and noise benefits with musical training are a topic of current debate. Some studies show them, some studies don't. It may depend a lot on the methodology of the particular participants. And so we need to understand better what the factors are. And that's why finding studies that do replicate and is an important issue. And I recommend a review by Emily Coffey and Robert Satori in hearing research for a review of speech and noise studies in musicians and some of the underlying issues that may be driving these differences between studies. Another area where we see associations between musical training and speech processing is enhanced second language learning. So, for example, the phonology and prosody of second languages. And here I can point you to a meta-analysis there's been pre-printed by Rachel Thompson and Bob Slevik and Salig from Bob's lab in University of Maryland, and it's up on SciArchive if you want to take a look. It's looked at 60 studies and over 3,000 participants and basically found a positive association between musical abilities or training and aspects of second language learning. Okay, so there seem to be these associations. But you might ask yourself, quite reasonably, to what extent are musician benefits in speech processing due to musical training versus to pre-existing differences in auditory abilities? And this is an important question to ask because twin studies reveal that several music-relevant auditory abilities are moderately heritable. Here's just a few of them. rhythm discrimination, pitch discrimination, melody discrimination, heritability estimates in males and females, and in the middle ranges. And these are just 3 of many that were examined in this very nice paper that came out last year. It's a review paper on music and genetics that I encourage you to take a look at if this interests you. So then that raises the question, can musical training cause neuroplastic changes in auditory motor processing circuits? Or are what we're seeing or are these benefits we see in musicians just all due to pre-existing differences in the brains of musicians and non-musicians that they're sort of born with? Well, to make a long story short, I think the answer to this question at the bottom of the slide is yes. And I will point you to several papers that I recommend if you want to dig into this more, showing that musical training can influence brain structure and function. A very interesting study by Peter Schneider and colleagues, actually a 12-year longitudinal study with measurements at 5 different time points of perception and neural measures from childhood to adulthood, looking at neuroanatomical disposition and training-induced plasticity. A nice review by Olusueka et al. In how musical training shapes the adult brain, again, the interaction of predispositions and plasticity, and a classic by Robert and Herholtz, musical training as a framework, thinking about some of the theoretical issues underlying music and music-driven brain plasticity. Now, what I want to call out in all of these papers and why I've chosen these 3 out of many others I could have possibly chosen is that they all emphasize this interplay of predisposing factors such as genetically governed differences in auditory cortex, morphology and function, and experience-dependent plasticity that's actually driven by musical training. So now we need more work in this area. We definitely need more longitudinal randomized controlled trials where music training is compared to other active controls, other kinds of engaging sorts of training that are not auditory motor. It could be other visual arts or sports and so forth, and controlling for motivation and other factors, and that's an important point. But I think based on the evidence we have, it seems like music training definitely can influence brain structure and function. Of course, there are many active questions about neuroplasticity driven by musical training. The auditory pathway is a big and complicated place from the cochlea to the cortex, as shown in this simplified diagram. And one interesting question is, does plasticity driven by musical training start at the cortex and then propagate to subcortical regions? Where does it begin and how does it move around? There's an interesting paper by Jessica McLean and Gavin Biddleman and others in cerebral cortex suggesting that things can start in the cortex and then then changes can go subcortically, or there's an interplay between them. Okay, so just this one figure I think is very helpful. This is from Peter Schneider's paper about this 12-year longitudinal study and his kind of neuro model, sort of neurodevelopmental model of how aptitude and training are interact. And the key point is here, it's not nature versus nurture. So for example, look at the bottom left of the slide. It says musical aptitude, native auditory skills, morphological disposition. So Schneider et al. See this as kind of innate factors that people are born with. They can make people vary in their musical aptitude, for example, or their native auditory skills. And then those in turn can influence musical experience, how much you listen to music, whether you're likely to practice music, which in turn can influence learning-induced plasticity. So learning-induced plasticity is experience-dependent, sort of the nurture part, but it's not completely separated from nature. Nature can predispose you to take up certain activities that then cause neuroplasticity. So you have nature-related factors like this one and the maturational plasticity driven by genetic factors, but you also have influences of listening experience and learning, and some of those are influenced by predispositions as well. And all of that ends up informing things like neurocognitive transfer effects. And plasticity by musical training is actually not confined to auditory cortex. This is an important point. It can influence many regions in the brain, especially regions connected by the dorsal auditory stream, which connects auditory regions with premotor planning regions and is important for both speech and music. This schematic of the auditory dorsal stream showing several fiber tracks comes from Robert's book, From Perception to Pleasure, The Neuroscience of Music, which I'll mention again later. Okay, so that's a bit about the motivation for asking the question, can musical training influence speech processing? But even if the answer is yes, even if we discover that the answer is yes, why in the real world would you use musical training to enhance speech processing? Again, not to replace speech-based training, but to complement it. Well, one important reason I think is music and reward. Engaging with music is rewarding for many people. And here I want to direct you to Robert's new book, From Perception to Pleasure, The Neuroscience of Music and Why We Love It, a terrific synthesis of the field of music neuroscience and the mechanisms behind how people derive pleasure from music, the brain mechanisms and cognitive mechanisms. And if you're not ready to jump into the pool and read a whole book yet, you could start with Robert's wonderful chapter on musical enjoyment and the reward circuits of the brain in Renee Fleming's new book on music in the mind, harnessing the arts for health and wellness. And here's just some data that we collected as part of a study we published last year of a histogram of how much pleasure people get from music. This is using the Barcelona Musical Reward Questionnaire, and you can see it's not a normal distribution. It's very skewed to the high end, where 120 is the maximal possible score there. Interestingly, it kind of mirrors the data we got when we gave people standard physical scales of pleasure, things that are physical pleasures like food and sex, and we look at how the distribution of how much people enjoy reporting those things. Again, not a normal distribution. So, you know, a lot of people do get a lot of pleasure out of music, and we can leverage this to get people to engage in music-based activities. Now, musical pleasure actually has several facets that are relatively independent, and some people actually do get little pleasure from music, and it's important to keep that in mind when thinking about music-based interventions, because maybe they're not a good idea for people that don't really find music rewarding. Here's some data again from our paper I did with Psyche Louis and Nick Kathios, showing 6 different dimensions of musical reward that are all computed from this extended Barcelona Musical Reward Questionnaire that builds on the original BMRQ by Mascherano and others. There's emotion evocation, that's the ability to get emotions out of music. There's sensory motor, the pleasure you get from playing and singing along. Social reward, the pleasure of sharing music with others, and so on. And you can see from this, this polygon histogram that musical anhedonics, there are people who get very little pleasure from music in any of these dimensions. And there's lots of interesting work now from multiple groups, including Robert's group, including about the neurobiology of musical anhedonia and differences in how their auditory and reward circuits are functionally and structurally connected. Okay, so again, let's go back to this kind of outline and ask, what do we mean by musical training? If we say, why use musical training to enhance speech processing in the real world? Well, one question about training is what degree and type of musical training is needed to influence speech processing? Well, the degree is an empirical question. Existing longitudinal studies that show an effect of music training on speech often take place over several months, like the well-known study of Silvan Moreno and colleagues, where 6 months of training of 8-year-olds in music with an active control group, I think it was painting, resulted in benefits in speech processing, even though speech wasn't being trained. This is why making the music training enjoyable is a key issue if you want people to engage in training that lasts over time. And in terms of the type of training, I think it's important to think about scaling the training to current abilities and interests. And that's what music therapists do, for example, when they come into a client's room and want to work with them to use music to solve some non-musical problem that they have or address some non-musical problem that they have. They don't start teaching them how to play Chopin etudes. They meet the people where they are and the skills that they have and kind of go from there. So in terms of degree and type of musical training that's needed to influence speech processing, a useful analogy here is exercise for health. Like, how much exercise do you need to improve your health? Well, obviously going out and, exercising for a week is not going to have any really meaningful long-term consequences. You have to do it sort of regularly to benefit your cardiovascular health. And if you want to do it in a way that's scaled to your current abilities, that's important too. So you don't want to necessarily go out and try to become a competitive tennis player winning competitions, but maybe you can enjoy playing tennis and do it at a level that's suited to you. Okay, so let me give you some now concrete examples of some populations that might benefit from musical training in terms of possible benefits to speech processing. One is young children at risk for dyslexia. This is an interesting population because people who study dyslexia recognize there's something called the dyslexia paradox, which is the window of most effective intervention for helping children with dyslexia is in kindergarten, when there are predictors that dyslexia is coming based on a variety of things, of language processing measurements. But the typical diagnosis window is 2nd grade and above, when they're already struggling and they're in great distress, their families are in great distress. And people recognize that we should be intervening much earlier than we typically do. We wait for diagnosis typically to intervene. So a key predictor that you can find in kindergarten is problems with phonological processing in terms of development of dyslexia or risk for dyslexia. And phonological processing utilizes temporal and rhythmic patterns in speech. And there are actually numerous studies that find associations between musical rhythmic processing abilities and phonological processing abilities. And these are reviewed in Shruti Nayak et al.'s paper in the Neurobiology of Language in 2022. And actually, if you want to take this into the real world, it's interesting that musical training in early childhood can take advantage of sensitive period effects, where for the amount of training you do, you get a boost in the effect that you have compared to that same amount of training later in life. And Virginia Penhune has thought and written a lot about this, including a very thoughtful paper in 2020 in Current Opinions in Behavioral Sciences. Okay. Another population is healthy older adults with declining speech and noise perception, which often happens with age. Pascal Tremblay at Laval is working on this and has a really interesting paper looking at brain structure and speech and noise perception in people that sing and don't sing. I recommend that to you, published in Human Brain Mapping, finding differences in the structure and the abilities in speech and noise perception of singers and non-singers. And actually, interestingly, if you have older adults sing in choir-like situations, that can also help combat social isolation in older adults, which can have other cognitive benefits. And then a third example is cochlear implant users who struggle with prosody perception. Cochlear implants can give very good segments, speech segments and words, but struggling with prosody, it's well known that they don't give great pitch perception, and people with cochlear implants often struggle with prosody perception. I was involved in a study with Charles Lim and Divya Chari and others, published a couple of years ago, where we used a custom-made keyboard and application that are all freely downloadable and available. The app is available, software for the app, to get people, the cochlear implant users, to play simple pitch contours, learn how to play simple pitch contours with differing degrees of pitch intervals, to see if that would improve melodic contour processing. And it did improve their auditory melodic contour processing. It was a short intervention. We didn't see benefits in prosody perception, but I think with a longer intervention, we might. So that's another area where music training might benefit speech processing. Okay, so then if musical training can influence speech processing, I think a really important issue is why. So we need theoretical frameworks to explain why this would happen. And that's why I got interested in proposing a framework for doing this, for thinking about this, and developed the opera hypothesis. And I should note that one inspiration for this was Krauss and Chandrasekharan's really wonderful paper in 2010, Music Training for the Development of Auditory Skills in Nature Reviews Neuroscience, and the associated research they'd been doing. And opera is now one of several frameworks for thinking about how music training and why music training would influence speech processing. Okay, so opera is based kind of on three ideas. The first is just the idea of neural overlap. There's overlap in some of the brain mechanisms that process the sounds of music and speech. This says instrumental music, but let's just generalize that to music in general, like singing too. This could happen at the low level, for example, in the midbrain, things like sensory encoding of frequency and timing patterns. At the mid-level, say secondary auditory cortex for processing of pitch contour patterns, or at the high level, say auditory frontal networks, for example, for auditory working memory. Second idea, and in a sense the core idea, is that there are asymmetric demands. For some overlapping mechanisms, music places higher demands on processing than speech does. And again, this could potentially happen at any of these levels. And we'll talk in more detail about this in subsequent slides. And the third idea is activating plasticity. And that is that musical training combines high processing demands with three factors that are known to promote neuroplasticity. Emotion and positive emotion. We know that activates the dopaminergic system. Lots of beautiful work on that. Robert summarizes this in his book. Repetition, when you want to do something musically and you want to get it right, you repeat, you practice, often in blocks or mass training, which is known to improve neuroplasticity. And attention, often when you're practicing music, you might attend to specific sound features. You want to really get the pitch right or the timing right. And it's known from animal studies that if an animal attends to specific sound features during auditory training, that drives plasticity in terms of neural encoding or processing of those features. Okay, So that's the kind of gist of it. There are overlapping networks for music and speech processing in the brain. At times, there are asymmetric processing demands where music asks more of those networks than speech. Music activates plasticity driven by emotion, repetition, and attention. And factors 2 and 3 drive the networks to higher levels of performance than needed for ordinary speech processing. Yet, since speech shares these networks with music, speech processing benefits. So that is the gist of the opera hypothesis. It was first published in 2011, and the original version focused on the demands that music placed on sensory processing, so sensory encoding of acoustic features and the precision that music versus speech required for that. An opera comes from overlap, precision, emotion, repetition, and attention. The expanded opera hypothesis considers the demands of both sensory and cognitive processing, and that was published in Hearing Research. And there I thought about things that cognitive factors that are important for both speech and music, like working memory, are involved in both speech and music, and something that can be trained. And there's a nice paper in Frontiers that reviews music training and working memory, published a couple of years ago. Okay, so I'll get back to that working memory bit a little later. So let's dive down a little bit into this idea of overlap versus non-overlap in speech and music processing. So we know there's cases of non-overlap, well-documented ones. We know that non-primary auditory cortex has neural populations selected for speech and music, and this has been found in fMRI studies playing listeners a wide range of sound. So this comes from the work of Sam Norman Hagneri and colleagues, and this is just one kind of schematic, their slides, where they present people with many different types of sounds, short snippets, and they use decomposition method to separate out neural populations that respond to different things. And some neural populations respond when sounds are higher or lower, or have other kind of basic acoustic features. But there were 2 categories of sounds that drove category selective responses, and only 2 that they found. So we had a population of neurons that responded whenever anything was speech selective population, shown here in yellow beneath the primary auditory cortex, which is shown by this white kind of line on this inflated view of the brain. And then a music selected population shown on the right side. And Dana Bobinger replicated this and showed it was true in non-musicians, so you didn't have to have musical training for this. And also, even if you heard music you weren't culturally familiar with. And this is interesting, right? There's not category selective population for sounds or environmental sounds. Speech and music were the only 2 that drove category selective kind of responses as opposed to feature-based responses. So there's non-overlap, definitely, for music and speech in parts of the brain and the auditory system. And we also know people can have differential impairment of speech or music processing that's either due to congenital factors or acquired after brain damage. And Isabelle Peretz has been a leader in studying this. She has a wonderful paper in Ticks in 2006 about true musical tone deafness or congenital amusia. And there's a very recent paper in the Journal of Neuroscience by a group in Finland that's been very active, looking at lesion patterns causing acquired amusia versus aphasia after stroke, showing differences in the regions involved. So there's non-overlap between speech and music in the brain. But there's also overlap. And one recent example that comes from a study using electrocorticography out of Eddie Chang's lab, led by Narayan Sankaran. And this was direct recordings from the brain surface of patients being monitored for seizures. So each electrode is thought to monitor a local neuropopulation, and they study high frequency activity in the gamma band range as a proxy for multi-unit activity of neurons. And they presented listeners with spoken sentences from the TIMIT database and with melodies from naturalistic musical recordings. So just to give you an example, here's some of the speech stimuli.
This is a sleeping capsule.
No temptation, no virtue.
Maybe it would work the other way.
So very clearly speech, and here's some musical stimuli from their study. Whoops. Okay, you get the idea. Oh man, that was bad. Sorry. Okay. Oh, we're back. Okay. So anyway, very clearly not speech, right? Okay, so this is what the participants heard, and they found one of the things they found was music selective electrodes. So here's recordings from one electrode that hearing all these different musical phrases and all these different utterances stacked up along the x-axis here, and each line is a raster plot of how much neural activity, and the averages are shown at the top. This electrode responded basically whenever something was music and didn't respond much whenever anything was speech. And these music selective electrodes were sort of scattered through the superior temporal gyrus, shown in blue here.
No, it's just.
Okay. On both the left and right side of the brain. So there are definitely music selective electrodes there. And interesting, those music selective electrodes responded to how unexpected a note was given the preceding notes based on a statistical model trained on Western popular melodies. So in a sense, they were responsive to musical expectation. But importantly, they also found electrodes that responded to both speech and music. Some responded similarly to pitch changes of comparable size and direction between syllables and musical tones. So here's a figure from the paper, and here we are on the superior temporal gyrus, and as you go anteriorly, these kind of pink colored electrodes were responding to similar size pitch changes, whether they happened in speech between syllables or musical notes in a melody. So this was interesting because it actually kind of lined up with some previous findings on subtle speech intonation processing deficits in people with musical tone deafness. So here's a case of overlap in neural processing of speech and music. So we have both non-overlap in some studies and overlap in others. That's why I say it's kind of like a Venn diagram situation. Just because you find non-overlap in one study doesn't mean you might not find overlap in another study looking at things in a different way, in this case, pitch contour processing. All right. So pitch contour processing is useful to think about in the context of the opera hypothesis, because we can think about the demands made by speech versus music on pitch contour processing. Pitch contours, we know, are important in both domains, right? The pitch of the voice going up and down signals all kinds of important things in speech. And in tone languages, it can distinguish between different words. In non-tone languages, it can mark emphasis or tell if it's a statement or a question, and so forth. But music seems to rely more on the fine-grained details of such contours than does ordinary speech. Slight changes can make big differences in music in a way that maybe not as true in speech for ordinary semantic understanding. So here's an example that Robert Story and Sherry Baum cooked up in a paper in 2012 to demonstrate this. And they took speech pitch contours of ordinary sentences, and they stretched them by a factor of 1.5. So imagine just making the highs higher and the lows lower. And then it said how obvious of a change is this to the ear, to the perceiver. So let's listen to this. Here's the original phrase they used.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
And here's the stretched version.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
Okay, they're maybe subtly different, and some almost hard to hear the difference though. But let's do that same exercise of stretching by 1.5 when somebody sings. Here's the first version.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Jack Frost nipping at your nose.
Okay, and here's the 1.5 stretch.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire, Jack Frost nipping at your nose.
Pretty salient. And you know, when we listen to music, we have a kind of a reference of pitch and pitch intervals that is pretty fine-grained, and a slight change can take you off pitch, off key, whereas when we speak, we don't talk about speaking out of tune in the same way. So these fine-grained details of pitch patterns seem to be important in music in ways that maybe not as high demands for speech. So what is the benefits, though, of better pitch contour processing for speech? So let's say music training improved your pitch contour processing. What good does that do you in the real world? Well, we see there are a number of studies that show that processing a pitch contour aids understanding speech in multi-talker settings. So that might be one potential benefit of better pitch processing. All right. So again, the overview of the framework: overlapping networks for music and speech processing, asymmetric processing demands, music greater than speech, and plasticity driven by emotion, repetition, and attention. Factors 2 and 3 drive the networks to higher levels of performance than needed for ordinary speech processing, but since speech shares those networks with music, speech processing benefits. So that's the kind of logic of the opera hypothesis. Now, I talked about pitch contour processing because it was relevant to what they found in the Eddie Chang study and the Narayan Sankaran study that I told you about, the ECOG study. But opera can be applied, the logic of opera can be applied to other things, not just pitch and pitch patterns, but also rhythm or working memory. And auditory working memory is an interesting one to think about, right? Because obviously we need working memory for both speech and music. You have to relate what you're hearing now to what came, just before. But with speech, we're always turning sound into meaning and recoding sound as the meaning of words. That's what we hold on to. So often we can't even exactly repeat what somebody just said to us, but we can tell them the gist of what they just said to us because we're not remembering every single word. We're just recoding meaning. We can't do that in music as easily. If your teacher wants you to play the passage in a particular way, they play it for you, and then you have to listen and hear the actual acoustics and try and play it back. So they both use working memory, but maybe music asks more of your working memory capacity than speech does. And in terms of overlap, one of the opera conditions, working memory for tonal material, seems to overlap with verbal working material in the brain. There's a study by Schultz et al. In human brain mapping that shows brain regions activated by verbal working memory, tonal working memory, and the overlap between them. And again, it's a Venn diagram situation. There's some areas that are exclusively for verbal, some for tonal, but there's also areas that overlap. And Nina Kraus and Straight have been involved in showing enhanced auditory working memory in musically trained individuals across different parts of the lifespan, and a correlation with years of musical training in terms of auditory working memory tests. There's been meta-analyses of musician advantages in auditory working memory, and I mentioned earlier another paper that has come out. This is an example of how music training may benefit cognitive processes that are relevant for speech processing. Okay, we're almost done. I'm going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. I just do point out that opera is now one of several frameworks aiming to explain why music training could influence speech processing. So there's a framework, synchronization and entrainment to pulse hypothesis, I believe, by Fuji and Wan. The precise auditory timing hypothesis by Tierney and Krauss, and the precise rhythm and speech, processing rhythm and speech and music framework by Fiveash and colleagues. And if you want to get a sense of these different frameworks and how they're similar or different to opera, there's a nice overview in Anna Fiveash's paper about processing rhythm and speech and music, published in Neuropsychology. Okay, so we've gone through our outline, I think. I've talked about motivation for asking why musical training can influence speech processing, and I've offered 3 reasons. We've talked about, even if the answer is yes, why would you do it in the real world? And we've talked about reasons for that, the relationship between musical and reward, scaling music to fit the individual, and in terms of musical training, and given some concrete examples of populations that might benefit from such training. And we've talked about theoretical frameworks and the importance of those for driving research forward in a hypothesis-driven way. And talked about opera, and I've mentioned that it's one of several frameworks now. So people have different emphases on what they're thinking about and the particular things they want to. For example, the SEP hypothesis talks about music and how it could benefit people with stuttering in terms of rhythm-based training, which is inspiring research, for example, by Simone Falk in Montreal. So different hypotheses have their different emphases, and I encourage you to take a look at the different ones. So to conclude, I asked this question, this talk: can musical training improve speech processing? And I think addressing this question has both theoretical and practical implications for research in auditory processing. And I believe that existing data and theoretical frameworks motivate pursuing this question quite seriously. Of course, we need more longitudinal randomized controlled trials, which would be the gold standard for addressing this question, especially with children, where I think you can get the most bang for your buck, and where the processing of music and language in terms of underlying cognitive and neural mechanisms may not be as separated as they are in adult brains. We could talk more about that in the Q&A. But high-quality longitudinal RCTs with active controls, so you're comparing music to other engaging things like sports or visual art. So you're controlling for motivation and other important variables. And studies that employ both behavioral and neural measures. And these kinds of studies are hard, right? Tracking people over time, multiple measurements over multiple time points, behavioral and neural. That's why there are few of them. I think they're enough to suggest that there's something promising here, but we certainly do need more. Okay, so that's it. And I just want to end with 2 resources for those interested in music cognition or music and health. One, I want to tell you that the Society for Music and Perception and Cognition has a new website, or revised website. And there's some useful things for trainees. Map of music cognition labs that you can zoom in and out and see where different labs are, what their different foci are. And that keeps growing as more labs get added. Narayan Sankaran, who did that nice ECOG study, just added his lab at University of San Francisco to the map. There's information about academic programs, both in North America and in Europe. I've just taken a screenshot of the North American ones, and each one of those will lead to a drop-down menu of all the different programs and links to them. Very useful resource for students. And then for those interested in the relationship between music and health, I want to point out the Sound Health Network, which was an initiative between NIH, the Kennedy Center, and UCSF that promotes research and public awareness about the impact of music on health and wellness. So please take a look at that if you want to look at projects that are trying to bridge between music, sound, health, and wellness research projects, NIH-funded projects, and projects funded by other organizations. So with that, I think I'll conclude, and I'll be happy to take some Q&A moderated by Robert. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ani, for that fantastic overview and very thorough, I would say, exposition of both the empirical and the theoretical kinds of concerns that have to be taken into account. And thank you also for all the shout outs. I think I need to give you a percentage of the royalties if they increase after this talk. So I'm sure there are many questions. And as I mentioned, we have our own little lab meeting here. I don't know if anyone from the lab wants to ask a question. As moderator, I get first dibs on questions. Are there any questions from our little group here? A lot of what you touched upon is extremely relevant to many different research topics. I think what's nice about this topic is that it does bring together all these different aspects, more from the cognitive side, more from the neuroscience side, from the developmental side, from the clinical side. So I think that's really cool. Maybe we'll go straight to the chat questions, but I just have kind of a global question to ask you, which is, I get the sense that despite all of the evidence that you cited, there's kind of a hardcore of people who somehow just don't buy into this and just deny the existence of these transfer effects. And I wonder what you think about that. Is that just a matter of having a high bar for appropriate sort of evidence, or why do you think there's such controversy behind it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I think as in science in general, replication is really important, and we do need to replicate studies to see which findings are reliable. And that's why these recent meta-analyses are very helpful, like the one coming out of Bob Slavik's lab on music aptitude and second language ability. So, I think it's fine to be skeptical, but I think at the end of the day, we're scientists, right? It's not a popularity contest. It's about evidence. And so we can all agree that high quality studies that replicate are ultimately the evidence that we will make our decisions based on. And yeah, people probably do have different bars. And we need the skeptics, but we also need people that are, enthusiastic and want to really drive this research forward and not just put the brakes on it. So I don't think we're in a bad state. I think some skepticism is healthy. I think people's personal relationship to music may play a role too. I don't know. Like you've shown that the wide variety of how much people value music. And for those who don't find it very interesting or important in their lives, maybe they think, why would this be something that would affect anything important, like speech?
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned in passing the replication study. Was it the one that Andrew Oxenham has been promoting? And I believe they even pre-registered that, if I'm not mistaken. Can you just say 2 words about that for the audience?
Yeah, I heard about it at SMPC, the Society for Music Perception and Cognition, this summer, and from Kelly Whiteford, who gave a talk about it. And I guess they're doing both behavioral and neural, trying to replicate some key papers and findings that showed musician advantages in terms of neural processing of sounds, speech sounds, and behavioral studies showing better, like speech and noise perception and so forth. I think it was maybe 8 labs involved. So I confess I haven't yet read the papers. There's one preprint now on the neural stuff, and I think they're working on the behavioral stuff. And I think they're finding some things replicate and some things don't. So that's as much as I know about it right now.
But I guess they did replicate your study with the spatially separated distractors.
Yeah, that did replicate.
So that's nice. Great. So I'm going to go to some of the questions on the chat. Rania Sharaf asks, did you consider comparing in adults between males and females under applied opera conditions?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I haven't really thought about looking at comparing males and females in terms of the effect of musical training on speech processing. It's interesting. I very quickly showed that slide from that music and genetics paper, the review. And it's interesting, for some of those abilities, I think maybe rhythm was one of them. Anyway, you do get different heritability estimates for men and women from twin studies. So that might be one reason to motivate potentially looking at differences in the effect of training. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to look at the interaction with the environmental influence, right?
Right.
There's a question from Maria Psores, whom I happen to know is a student of Virginia Penn, who says, can you comment on how learning music and speech differ in top-down, bottom-up error correction? How does this inform how learning one will transfer onto the other?
How they differ in terms of bottom-up versus top-down error corrections?
Yes.
I'm not totally sure I understand the question. Robert, do you have any idea what we're getting at?
Well, my understanding of it would be that both music and speech involve bottom-up and top-down processes.
Sure.
So how does
It does
that
involve error correction? That's true. Yeah.
Yes. So might that be relevant in understanding how they transfer, or maybe another way, I'm just thinking out loud, another way to think about it might be to the extent that sometimes there is not any transfer, could it be because music and speech tasks make different demands on bottom-up or top-down processes?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that would be interesting to think about. I mean, I guess the trick is to figure out experimental ways to disentangle those things, given especially how interactive cortical and subcortical centers are in training and so forth. But certainly merits thinking about. thanks for the question, but I don't really have a good answer for you right at the top of my head.
A question from Julia Lehman, who says, thank you for your insightful talk. What are your thoughts about musical training and cognitive reserve?
That's a very interesting question. In fact, there's a really nice paper, 2023, by Bill Thompson and colleagues on music and cognitive reserve that I just shared with a colleague. I sent it to Isabel Peretz just yesterday, so you'd think it would be on the top of my mind. If you give me 1 minute, I will pull it up because it's worth reading. Wolf et al. I highly recommend this paper. Music Engagement as a Source of Cognitive Reserve by Lee Wolf and others, including William Ford Thompson or Bill Thompson. And basically their conclusion is that it looks promising that engaging with music could be a source of cognitive reserve for as you age. And yeah, there's lots of interesting things to say there. Like, for example, we know exercise helps with cognitive reserve being the ability to maintain healthy brain function in the face of biological degradation in brain structure. And we know music actually can get people to exercise more because it motivates them. So there could be indirect effects between music and cognitive reserve. So if music gets you to exercise more, and exercise is the causal thing that helps cognitive reserve, then music could affect cognitive reserve indirectly. But there are also potential direct effects. Yeah.
There's a question from Warren Bakai, who says, were you able to look at mild to moderate hearing loss and or noise exposure history with respect to the opera conditions? Yes.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
I have not done that myself. I mean, I worked on that study with the cochlear implant users with Charles Lim, but that's the extent that I've worked on people with hearing loss. But the opera hypothesis did inspire that cochlear implant study. So, yeah.
Good. There's I guess, a comment from our colleague Peter Frodischer, who says frequency following response did not replicate. I believe he's referring to a preprint that has not yet been peer reviewed, which was a large multi-center study attempting to replicate the phenomenon of enhanced amplitude in frequency following response among musicians. So this kind of gets back to my first question about, there's still controversy about this. I have looked at that. Well, I should ask what you think about it before I give you my opinion.
Yeah. I need to read it first, but I can render an opinion. Yeah, so that's interesting. So the frequency following the subcortical enhancements that were seen in musicians for musically trained individuals for speech sound processing. I guess some of them have not replicated in this multi-site study. So yeah, okay. I mean, I think the particular neural locus at which benefits, which networks in the brain change as a function of musical training. It doesn't have to be subcortical circuits that change. It could be cortical circuits that change. I think we need to be looking across the brain, not just in one part of it.
Yeah, and that would be sort of my perspective as well, that although all of the studies in this replication were using EEG, and EEG, first of all, blends all the sources, and secondly, is less sensitive to the cortical sources than the subcortical sources. In our lab, we've used MEG to dissociate the cortical and subcortical ones. And indeed, I would expect musical training maybe to have more of an influence on cortical insofar as it's, a more likely system that would be plastic as opposed to subcortical structures that are, kind of more hardwired. So, and I guess in a more general way, coming back to the topic of replication, I think sometimes there's a sense where people say, oh, well, we failed to replicate and that's the end of the story. Close the book, it's all done. And I find that kind of nihilistic. In other words, if someone's found if a bunch of people have found a phenomenon and a bunch of other people can't replicate it, it just means that we have two conflicting sets of findings. It doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. It just means we need to understand why there's that discrepancy.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I totally welcome these studies that have, tried to do a more systematic kind of replication. And so if they don't find the same thing, well, there must be a reason, right? And I don't think we can just dismiss it all and say statistical artifact, and that's it, and now we can all go home.
Hmm.
I think we have to do more work. But that's my soapbox, and I'm not supposed to be standing on it. You are. Here's a question. Do you have any advice for developing controls for musical training? For example, visual art, theater, etc.
Yeah, I think some other form of demanding sensory motor training that's not auditory would be good. Like sports is a good one, I think. That's people find sports very rewarding. It has social kind of as well as kind of learning skills, individual skills. There's social benefits because people enjoy playing sports with others, just like people enjoy playing music with others. And it's been used by, for example, I think Asal Habibi in her longitudinal work on music training in the brain and cognitive function in children at University of Southern California. I think it's a very good control. People have also used painting as another kind of artistic control, but that's more often individualistic rather than group oriented. So that's one potential limitation there. And maybe we have to find out rewarding. Yeah.
Thank you. There's a interesting question from Bob Slavic, who says, I'm curious about your thoughts on the variety of music training or experience or whatever that's involved in this kind of work. My sense is that some of the variability in findings might reflect work using pretty different concepts of what it means to be musical. So
yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yes, I think that's a really good point, Bob. We throw around this term musical training, but it can mean very different things, right? So, you can be just playing like rhythmic games with children that are essentially just games to them, but you are training more precise rhythmic timing skills. Whereas with an adult, you might actually be training them to play, small piano pieces. So I think we have to be a little more fine-grained about what exactly we mean by that term in terms of these studies, and that may be one reason why we're seeing different findings in different studies, is that musical training is not the same from one study to the next. So we should probably have developed some sort of system framework for classifying different types of musical training.
Yeah, indeed. There's a question from Jessica Edgar, who says, you're talking about the separation between music and language, and you used examples of both instrumental music and vocal music. How do you consider singing in that separation relating to the overlap in processing with both linguistic and timbral information?
Yeah, great question. I think singing, is to my mind, being much more closely related to speech because it does use words often, typically. Would lead me to believe that there's transfer effects would be even stronger there. But of course, then is it even transfer if you're using words or maybe you're just singing slows down speech, maybe makes the spectral transitions slower and more salient, and therefore it's a form of speech-based training. So my papers have focused on instrumental musical training, partly because I wanted to kind of specifically look at whether musical training independently of training with the use of words and speech would influence speech processing. But I think it's a really important type of training that could be very important in the real world, like the work that Pascal Tremblay is doing with older adults and singing, especially in groups, and their effect on speech processing.
Yes, so I suspect that kind of training would be the same, even if the training and that the consequence of the training would be the same, even if the singing involved only, for example, vocalese and not
interesting. Yeah, right.
Speech with words, right?
Right.
But
some timbral
would
variation.
be a weird experiment to try, but
sing this wordless piece for 20 minutes. Yeah.
There's an interesting comment from our friend Florencia Asaneo from Mexico, who points out that she and Pablo Ripolles recently published a nice paper, which in fact, we're going to do a lab meeting on it in PLOS, where they suggest a framework for thinking about the conflicting results and lack of replication and so on. And if I recall corrected, Florencia, you can correct me. The idea is that maybe the critical element has to do with rhythm and here's Florencia. Maybe I'll let Florencia say what her explanation is rather than me trying to paraphrase it.
Hi,
Hi,
how are you?
good.
Yes, basically you are right, Robert. We believe that this is due to the rhythmic abilities and that this could be beneficial for some participants, but not for all, because some of them are already up in the rhythmic abilities without any kind of training. At least for some of the abilities that we believe that are being enhanced.
I look forward to taking a look. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that could be particularly interesting also with respect to the underlying neural pathways involved, because I would think that the rhythmic aspect is going to be more dependent upon the dorsal pathway. And there's also a very recent paper that just came out by, I think it's Lumaka et al. From the Aarhus group from Denmark, where they do some network analysis and show that musical skills and abilities are heavily loading onto the connectivity measures associated with the dorsal stream, which I think that fits in very well with what Florencia and Pablo are saying about rhythm.
Interesting. Yeah.
So maybe the dorsal stream is where we should be focusing on in terms of plasticity and transfer effects.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think we're out of time. If anyone else has questions, they should contact Ani directly.
Please. Yeah.
And I think we should just close the session in the interest of time, even though we could continue chatting about this all afternoon. And I will say thank you again to Ani on behalf of everyone who's listening in for the sort of masterclass on plasticity and music. And I guess this is the first of a series of talks from ARO. And I'm sorry, I don't have the program in front of me, but all of you who are listening in, you should look at the sequence of talks that are coming up, because I think they're all really good and really interesting.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, and thank you to the ARO for doing this.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.